Everyone mocked the veteran living under the old Wyoming Bridge until his dog started digging after a storm and uncovered something no one was supposed to find. What the FBI discovered beneath that bridge rewrote a piece of history. Like and subscribe if you believe some heroes never stop serving. The bridge groaned when the wind passed through its hollow ribs. Beneath it, between rusted pillars, stood a small shelter of plywood and army tarps, Jack Mercer's home. 52 years old, his back still straight in that way only the military could train into a man. Jack carried himself like a soldier, even when he was just heating a can of soup over a propane stove. His beard had gone gray before its time, but his hands were steady, calloused and precise, the hands of someone who used to build things meant to last. Now, he lived under something built by others, a bridge that outlived its purpose just like him. Ranger, his German shepherd, dozed nearby, one paw over a worn tennis ball, ears twitching at every noise from the road above. The dog was big sable-coated and sharp-eyed, a rescue from a K-9 program that no longer existed. Sometimes Jack thought the two of them were the same, trained for a mission no one remembered anymore. When dawn came, the light slid down through cracks in the bridge, painting Ranger's fur in thin gold lines. The river murmured below, slow and cold, and the world above kept moving without them. Jack's mornings were always quiet, marked by ritual more than reason. He shaved in a cracked mirror, wiped the condensation off with an old shirt, poured coffee from a dented thermos. He still polished his boots every Sunday, even though there was nowhere to go. When the town kids biked past, they called him the Bridge Man. But the local diner owner, Mrs. Heller, sometimes left a bag of stale bread by the bridge. She never said anything, and neither did he. Once, a social worker came. She asked if he wanted help finding shelter. Jack had stared at her clipboard and replied softly, "Ma'am, I've had enough roofs fall on me for a lifetime." She didn't come back. Around noon, semis started thundering across the bridge. Every time one passed, the metal plates rattled, and Ranger bolted upright, barking savagely toward the north embankment, always the same direction. His fur stood up, eyes blazing. Jack would grab his collar steady but not angry. "Easy, boy. That's not ours anymore." He said it like muscle memory, the words falling out before he even thought them. He'd look across the weeds and see only a fenced patch of dirt and the faint outline of an access road that disappeared into the trees. Nothing there. Yet every time his stomach tightened as if a string beneath his ribs had been pulled taut. He didn't know why. That patch of land had been fenced off since before he got here. Locals said it belonged to the county part of the old Camp Delton Range, abandoned military ground. But to Jack, it felt familiar in a way that hurt. Sometimes at night when rain hammered the bridge, he dreamed of sand instead of snow. The air smelled of dust and diesel. He'd hear the dull thud of explosions far off, and someone shouting orders in a voice he almost recognized. Then a flash, a sound like metal tearing and nothing. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, the echo of that voice still in his ears. He never remembered the words, just the feeling, command and fear mixed together. He'd sit up Pet Ranger's head and whisper, "It's over, pal. We're home." But even as he said it, the word home felt foreign, like something he'd borrowed from someone else. Redwater wasn't cruel, just indifferent. People tolerated him the way they tolerated the bridge, ugly, broken, but too much work to tear down. Jack never looked up. He'd just keep staring at the dark water and the reflection of headlights sliding over it as if waiting for something to surface. When winter came, frost formed along the beams like veins of silver. Jack patched leaks in the tarp, bundled Ranger in an old army blanket, and burned driftwood in a metal drum. The smoke rose through the cracks, curling between the bridge rails like a signal no one noticed. Once in a while, he'd walk into town, cash his veteran's check, and buy supplies. The cashier would always say, "You still down by the bridge?" and he'd nod too polite to add, "Where else would I be?" That night, a cold wind swept through Redwater. The bridge creaked louder than usual, and Jack lay awake staring at the low ceiling of his makeshift shelter. Ranger shifted beside him, ears flicking. Somewhere above, a truck slowed its brakes, sighing. The sound faded, but Ranger didn't relax. He growled low deep in his chest and faced that same northern patch of earth. Jack's breath misted in the dark. Easy, boy, he murmured again. Voice softer, now almost sad. That's not ours anymore. He didn't know why he said it, only that he always did, and that the words felt truer than they should. The dog went quiet, but Jack couldn't shake the chill crawling up his spine. It wasn't the cold. It was recognition. He just didn't know of what. The rain began before dawn. A thin hiss at first, then a steady drumbeat that grew heavier until it sounded like the sky itself was trying to wash the world clean. Jack woke to the rhythm pounding above the bridge, the concrete trembling faintly with each drop. Water seeped through the cracks in the beams, dripping onto the tin cup he'd left out to catch leaks. Ranger was already awake, pacing near the flap of tarp that served as their door. His ears twitched toward the riverbank, his tail stiff muscles quivering. Jack rubbed his eyes, groggy. It's just rain, buddy. Go back to sleep. But Ranger didn't. He pressed his nose to the opening and whined a sound too low, too anxious. Outside, the world was gray and alive. The river had swelled, chewing at its banks, carrying broken branches and mud downstream. Jack stood at the edge of his shelter, feeling the damp air bite into his skin. The wind carried the scent of earth and rust. He could hear the distant moan of the bridge above, steel joints stretching under the storm's weight. He'd seen structures fail before. Water always wins. He checked the ropes that held his shelter, tightened one where the knot had slipped, then looked toward the north bank. The ground there was darker, soaked through the fence, tilting slightly, as if the earth beneath it had sighed. Ranger growled. "All right," Jack muttered, pulling on his jacket. "Let's check it out." They climbed the embankment together, boots sinking into the mud rain, slicing sideways across their faces. The air smelled faintly metallic, like old machinery waking up. When they reached the fence, Jack saw what had made the dog uneasy. The ground beyond had collapsed, a chunk of it sliding down toward the river. The fence leaned at a crooked angle, half buried, and where the soil had torn away, something glinted dully beneath the sludge, a surface not of stone or root, but steel. Ranger lunged forward, barking furiously, claws tearing into the wet dirt. Jack grabbed his collar. "Easy, you'll break your paws." The dog ignored him, pawing harder, sending clumps of mud flying. Jack swore under his breath, more out of habit than anger, and knelt beside him. He dug with both hands, pushing aside the soaked earth until the glint became a surface, wide and flat, cold under his fingers. A layer of rust coated the edges, and through the grime, faint letters appeared, U.S. Property Restricted Site. Jack froze. His pulse kicked once hard. He wiped more mud away, revealing the outline of what looked like a heavy plate, the kind used for sealed access covers. Rainwater pooled in the grooves. "What the hell?" he whispered, then stopped himself, the words dying in his throat. Ranger kept barking, tail low, voice echoing off the bridge above. Jack pressed his hand against the plate, trying to gauge how deep it went. It didn't move, but as his fingers brushed along the edge, they caught on something, a small indentation, perfectly shaped for a handhold. Without thinking, he slid his fingers into it. Left, right. Pull. Safety latch. The words came out of his mouth before he even knew he was speaking. His hand moved automatically, twist, lift, slide, the motion clean, practiced. He froze, halfway through breath caught in his chest. He hadn't done that in years, but his body had remembered the sequence with the certainty of repetition. He stared at his hand at the mud-covered latch, and a flicker of memory rushed through him so fast it made his vision tilt. A flash of metal corridors, a hum of fluorescent lights, his own voice saying the same words inside a different storm. Then it was gone. The rain filled the silence, loud now, almost angry. Jack blinked, pulled his hand back, and looked at the dog who was watching him as if waiting for an order. His heart hammered unevenly. He knew military engineering. He'd built storage vaults, bunkers, missile housings, but this was older. Wrong shape, wrong depth. And that marking restricted site should have been decommissioned decades ago. He crouched lower, traced the edge again. It was solid, anchored deep. The ground around it had shifted just enough to expose the corner like something buried too long, finally taking a breath. Left, right, pull. Safety latch, he repeated quietly, tasting the words. They felt familiar on his tongue, the rhythm of command. Ranger nudged his arm, whining now not in fear but impatience. Jack looked at him, rain dripping from the brim of his hood. "You've been barking at this spot all along, haven't you?" The dog didn't answer, just stared at the steel plate ears forward steady. Jack leaned back on his heels, his knees sinking into the mud, and exhaled slowly. The wind shifted, carrying the faintest vibration through the plate, a deep, hollow thud from somewhere below like the echo of a door settling in its frame. He blinked, unsure if he'd imagined it. The river roared, the bridge groaned again, and above it all, Ranger's growl rumbled like distant thunder. Jack placed his hand on the plate one more time. It was colder now, unnaturally so, and his fingertips tingled as if the metal itself recognized him. By the next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a world washed clean, but unsettled. The bridge dripped with slow, steady rivulets, and fog curled off the river like smoke from an invisible fire. Jack stood at the edge of the embankment, staring at the slab of steel half buried in the mud. The words, U.S. Property, Restricted Site, looked sharper, now that the rain had rinsed them clean. He'd tried sleeping, but couldn't. His mind kept circling back to the way his hand had moved automatic precise. Left-right pull. It wasn't something you could accidentally know. He didn't like what that meant. By noon, a sheriff's truck rolled down the service road, tires splashing through puddles. Sheriff Donnelly was a broad man with a face like weathered oak and a voice that carried authority even when soft. "Morning, Jack," he said, stepping out. "Heard you found something." Jack nodded toward the slope. "Or maybe it found me." Donnelly squinted at the exposed metal, rubbed the back of his neck. "That's not a septic tank, that's for sure." He turned to Jack. "You didn't try to open it, did you?" Jack hesitated. "Just brushed off some dirt." The sheriff sighed, already reaching for his radio. "I'm calling it in. Could be old ordnance, and I'm not losing a deputy to a booby trap from the Cold War." Jack wanted to argue, but didn't. Something about the way the sheriff said ordnance made his stomach tighten again. Within hours, the place changed. County vehicles lined the dirt road. Yellow tape went up. Men in reflective vests and bomb suits walked the site, their movements careful and deliberate. Jack watched from the base of the bridge ranger at his side, both uneasy. The hum of official voices carried through the damp air, clipped and professional. A white SUV pulled up late in the afternoon, clean and government plain. A woman stepped out mid-30s, hair tied back, black jacket with an FBI patch on the shoulder. She spoke briefly to Donnelly, then turned her gaze toward Jack. Even from a distance, she studied him the way people study evidence, not strangers. "Mr. Mercer," she asked when she approached. Jack nodded. "That's me." "Sarah Collins," she said, flashing her badge. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. I understand you discovered the object. It discovered itself," he said, eyes on the slab. The rain took care of the rest. Collins glanced at Ranger, who watched her silently. "Is that your dog, partner?" Jack corrected. He found it first. "Good instincts," she replied, not smiling. "Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Jack shrugged. "You're already asking." They stood under the bridge's shadow, while agents measured, photographed, and documented the site above them. Collins flipped open a notepad. "Mr. Mercer, you served in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, correct?" "That's right." "When did you leave the service, 2010? "Medically retired, head injury." He nodded once. "You recall any assignments related to weapons storage or recovery?" Jack frowned. "You mean like this? Anything that might have involved restricted sites, sealed facilities, or classified operations?" Her eyes never left his face. He shook his head slowly. "If I had, I don't remember." She wrote something down. "There's a record here," she said finally, glancing at her tablet. "Your name appeared in a Department of Defense Ordnance Inventory audit from 2009 as the registered custodian key. That audit concerned missing tactical ordnance. Classified operation later closed as an accident. Does that sound familiar?" Jack stared at her, genuinely confused. "I was in Iraq in 2009, not Wyoming." "Yes," she said. "The report mentions a storage facility overseas. But your name was attached to the inventory list. Your clearance level then would have allowed you access to materials like the ones we think might be under that plate. His jaw tightened. "And you think I took them, hid them here?" Collins didn't flinch. "I think I need to understand why your fingerprints might show up on a site that should have been sealed 30 years ago." Jack let out a slow breath. Not anger, but exhaustion. "If I had taken anything, would I still be living under a bridge?" Her expression softened just for a second. Then she looked past him toward the muddy slope where technicians were working. "Sometimes people hide where no one will look." "Lady," he said quietly, "I'm not hiding. I just stopped moving." Collins closed her notebook. "Either way, Mr. Mercer, until we know what that site is, you're part of the report." She'd signaled to another agent who carried a sealed evidence kit. "We'll need to take your prints just to eliminate you from the chain of contact." Jack extended his hands without protest. The agent rolled ink across his fingers, pressed them to paper, efficient and detached. Ranger growled once low in his throat, but Jack hushed him. When they were done, Collins thanked him politely, her professionalism unshaken. As she walked back toward the convoy, Jack called out Agent Collins. She turned. "What happens if it's not a weapon?" She considered that for a moment. "Then we find out what someone thought was worth burying." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of wet metal. Collins climbed into her SUV and drove off, leaving Jack and Ranger alone by the riverbank. The tape fluttered in the breeze, bright yellow against the gray sky. Jack watched it whip back and forth, uneasy, a line drawn between the past and whatever waited beneath their feet. The next morning, the bridge was swarmed again, but this time it wasn't local law enforcement. 2 black SUVs from the Bureau had arrived before dawn, their headlights slicing through the mist. Jack stood by his tarp shelter, a thermos of coffee in hand, watching as men in protective suits unloaded a remote-controlled unit, an EOD robot with a mechanical arm and camera feed. The FBI wasn't wasting time. Agent Collins moved among the team with a brisk authority, her voice steady but clipped. "Secure the perimeter. No one near the north bank until we confirm stability." She saw Jack and gave a short nod in acknowledgement without warmth. He nodded back, knowing better than to offer help. He had seen enough operations to know that civilians, especially ones living under bridges, were liabilities, not partners. Still, something in him couldn't stay away. He stood at the yellow tape ranger at his side, watching as the robot's treads churned through mud toward the steel plate. Its camera light flickered against the wet surface. "Signal's stable," one of the techs said. "We're reading minor magnetic interference, but the structure's intact." Collins leaned toward the monitor, eyes narrowing. "Can we access the locking mechanism?" "Looks like it's biometric," the tech replied. "Hybrid access module. Handprint plus near-field voice and gate recognition. Power source might still be live." Jack frowned. If it's biometric, that means it was built post-Cold War. Late 90s, maybe early 2000s. Collins turned to him, slightly surprised. "You know the model I built a few like it," he said quietly. "Corps of Engineers used similar tech for classified depots. Old military habit, never throw good hardware away." She studied him for a moment, as if reevaluating something, then gestured to her tech. "Try it anyway. Let's see if we can spoof it." The operator sent the robot's arm forward, positioning its scanning pad over the recessed panel. The machine emitted a faint hum. A small light blinked red. Then, as the robot adjusted its angle, the red light flickered, pulsed once, then turned a clear green. The ground seemed to hold its breath. The steel plate shuddered with a sound that was not rust-breaking but hydraulics engaging. The technician froze. "Ma'am, it just powered on." Collins stepped closer to the monitor. "Did you activate it negative?" It reacted on its own. "Wait, there's data streaming?" The speakers crackled and a flat electronic voice echoed through the open air, mechanical and old, but unmistakable. "Access recognized. Captain Mercer, clearance level 3. Everyone stopped moving. Collins turned slowly toward Jack, her face caught between disbelief and calculation. What did it just say he didn't answer? He felt the words sink into him like a stone through water. Captain Mercer. Clearance level 3. The title sounded wrong and right, at the same time a memory whispered from a place he'd buried. "You heard it?" One of the agents murmured, uneasy. It recognized him. Collins held up a hand to silence them. "Stay where you are, Mr. Mercer." He raised both palms, slightly defensive but calm. "I didn't touch anything." "You don't have to," she said, eyes narrowing. "It knows you." Jack swallowed his throat dry. "That's not possible. It just said your name," she replied evenly. "You're telling me you have no idea why?" He shook his head. "No idea. I was a captain, yes, but I lost that commission over a decade ago." Collins folded her arms. "Why?" Jack hesitated. The past pressed close, heavy and familiar. "I disobeyed a direct order," he said finally. "They told me to collapse a test storage site in Iraq. Said it was compromised. I checked the manifest first. It wasn't. It was a supply cache. Someone wanted it gone for reasons that didn't make sense, and you refused. I delayed," he corrected. "And the delay cost lives. At least that's what the report said." Collins's expression softened slightly, but her tone remained professional. "So they stripped your rank and sent me home," he said. "Medically retired after an explosion. Memory damage, they called it. Traumatic brain injury. I don't remember half of what came after." Collins looked back toward the plate, now humming faintly green light, still pulsing like a heartbeat. "You said that scanner was early 2000s tech. If it recognizes your credentials, that means you were registered to it during or after your Iraq deployment. That would place your clearance renewal stateside, not overseas." "That doesn't make sense," he muttered. "I never served domestic operations after 2005. "Apparently, you did," she said quietly. The team kept their distance, unsure whether to treat him as a suspect or a key. Jack could feel their eyes on him, the weight of a world he thought he'd left behind. He looked at the steel plate again, the green glow reflecting faintly off the waterlogged mud. His name still echoed in his ears. Captain Mercer, Clearance Level 3. That wasn't a coincidence. It was history reaching out through the dark, reminding him of something he had done and forgotten. Collins approached, voice lower now. "If you want to help, Captain, you might want to start remembering why this thing thinks you still belong to it." Jack's breath came slow, controlled, the way he used to steady himself before detonating charges. He looked past her to the old access road that wound toward the hills, a road he now realized he'd walked dozens of times without knowing why. Ranger shifted beside him, uneasy as if sensing the shift in gravity around them. The air felt charged not with electricity but recognition. Something buried deeper than steel had just woken up. By the following afternoon, the ground had been cleared and the heavy machinery arrived. The Bureau had called in a containment team from Cheyenne EOD specialists and structural engineers. Jack watched from a few yards away as they rigged a lifting crane above the steel hatch. Collins stood near the command tent headset on giving short, clipped instructions. The tension around the site was no longer curiosity. It was control. The green light on the panel had gone dark again, but when Jack approached within 10 feet and spoke, the embedded microphone captured his command cadence. The system authenticated a stored voice and gate profile and disengaged the lock with a quiet click, followed by the faint sigh of hydraulics releasing pressure. The crane's cable tightened, metal squealed, and the plate lifted slowly from the earth. A wave of cold air spilled out from below, stale and metallic, untouched by decades of sun. The light from the flood lamps reached only a few feet down before disappearing into shadow. Atmospheric sensors first, Collins ordered. Technicians lowered a probe and data began to scroll across the screen. Normal oxygen-elevated dust trace lubricants, no radiation spike. We're clear, a tech confirmed. Temperature 38 degrees. Internal power is active on a maintenance backfeed line. Collins exhaled. Send the drone. The small reconnaissance drone descended through the opening, its light cutting through layers of dust. Jack leaned closer to the monitor as the image flickered into focus. A concrete tunnel ribbed with steel supports leading to a chamber sealed by another door. On the wall, barely visible under grime, were faded stencils, numbers, and military codes. Then, as the drone turned its light, words appeared in flaking paint. Operation Sentinel, Site 7. Collins stiffened. Pause feed. Zoom on that. The operator magnified the image. The paint was old Cold War era, but the stenciling style was modern early 2000s. Sentinel, she murmured. That name's not in any declassified Cold War program. She looked at Jack. You ever heard of it? Jack hesitated. The word hit something deep, a sound from a long-forgotten frequency. He rubbed his temples, trying to chase it, but the memory stayed just out of reach. Maybe, he said softly. Not sure. Collins nodded to her team. We're going in. The descent was slow, cautious. They lowered a ladder, secured harnesses, and sent 2 agents down first. Jack followed under Collins's watch, his boots finding each rung carefully. The air grew colder as they descended, filled with the scent of oil and metal. At the bottom, their lights flared across the chamber. It was bigger than anyone expected, an underground vault reinforced with titanium plating, rows of crates stacked neatly against the walls, each one stenciled with U.S. Army property, do not deploy. The dust on the floor was thick, untouched. Collins approached the nearest crate, brushed away grime, and read the marking aloud. FIM 92, Stinger 14 units. Her voice dropped. These are live missile systems. Another crate was marked 120 MMDU uranium, depleted ammunition sealed in titanium-lined containment canisters rated for aquatic environments. A third, smaller container bore an emblem not of the Army, but the Federal Reserve, sealed wax still intact. Collins knelt, scraping away dirt until she could read the faded tag, Federal Reserve Transfer Batch 1989. This isn't just ordnance, she whispered. This is currency. One of the agents pried open a corner of the box. Inside, gold bars gleamed faintly in the flashlight beams, their serial numbers perfectly preserved. Collins straightened, her jaw set. Who buries gold and missiles in the same vault, assets from different eras consolidated as a single contingency stack? Jack's voice was quiet. People planning for the end of something. Collins turned. Meaning contingency caches, he said. We built sites like this in Iraq after 2003. Bunkers to store materials in case command centers fell. Redundancy storage. Weapons, communications gear, sometimes currency. Insurance policies for collapse. You built them? She asked. He nodded slowly. Engineering Division, Fort Leonard Wood. But not under this name. He pointed to the stenciling. Operation Sentinel, that's newer. Collins moved toward the back wall where a desk sat half buried under debris. She cleared it and found a sealed folder marked Classified. Inside were a few yellowed pages, water-stained but legible. The top page bore an official header, U.S. Department of Defense Contingency Operations Directive. Below that, typed lines. In case of national collapse, assets to be sealed and guarded until authorized retrieval. Assigned command clearance, Captain John Mercer, Engineering Division. Collins looked up sharply. It names you. Jack's breath caught. The letters blurred for a moment. His own name foreign on the paper. Then faint and uninvited, a voice surfaced in the back of his mind. Deep and calm. The voice of a superior he could no longer name. If Washington burns, you guard what's left. The words hit like a shockwave. He remembered standing in a bunker much like this one, younger uniform, crisp, his team exhausted from digging. They had used old Cold War structures to house new stockpiles, small caches across the country, silent, invisible, ready to survive chaos. And then the explosion, the loss, the discharge. The memory snapped away before he could hold it. Collins was watching him closely. You remember something? Not enough, he said quietly, only that this wasn't supposed to exist. And if it does, someone kept it alive long after it should have been sealed. Collins folded the folder, her expression unreadable. Then we just stepped into something that was never meant to be found. The vault's lights flickered once faintly, as if acknowledging her words. Ranger barked from the opening above, the sound echoing through the steel chamber, sharp and urgent. The discovery changed everything. Within 24 hours, Washington had taken over the investigation. New agents arrived, men in dark suits who said little and listened less. The site became a maze of tarps and sealed containers. Collins remained in charge locally, but her expression grew harder, her eyes sharper. Jack was confined to the perimeter under the pretense of observation, though everyone knew he was being watched. He didn't protest. He only wanted answers. That evening, Collins found him by the fire under the bridge ranger stretched at his feet. The wind had turned cold again, and the lights from the excavation flickered across the river like ghosts. She crouched near the fire, holding a sealed envelope. "You might want to see this," she said. Inside were photocopies, military forms with creased edges. One bore a familiar stamp, Sentinel-4, Engineering Detachment, Final Report, 2007. At the top, a typed summary read, "Unit assigned to decommission Site 7 Redwater Facility. Casualty report explosion during maintenance procedure. Status all KIA except one. Mercer John presumed missing." Collins looked at him. "That's you." Jack stared at the page, the words swimming in and out of focus. "They said I died. According to the personnel system, you were later classified administratively deceased after being listed missing. The explosion was ruled accidental in that channel, but Ordnance Inventory Systems retained your credentials as a custodian key, which is why your name still appears on a 2009 audit." She flipped another page. "But that's not the whole story. There's a second report. It was buried deep in the archives, classified, not declassified with the others." She handed it to him. The header was different. Cleaner, newer internal audit summary, Office of Special Contingencies. Beneath it, preliminary conclusion explosion was staged to erase evidence of Sentinel assets. Surviving member presumed complicit in concealment. Jack's chest tightened. "So it was fake," he whispered. Collins nodded slowly. "Someone wanted that vault gone from the record. They faked your deaths and sealed the paper trail." He looked up from the page. "And you think I helped them?" "I think you stopped them," she said quietly, "but I can't prove it yet." The words hit him harder than accusation. They stirred something beneath the fog in his mind, fragments of heat, sound, and fear. He closed his eyes and let the images surface. A dim tunnel, the smell of fuel men shouting. He saw his own hands fitting detonators into the wall, not in panic, but purpose. His voice giving orders, steady calm. "We lock it down. No one moves this outside the border." Then another voice, sharper, over a radio. "Captain Mercer, that's a direct order. You move the containers, or you're relieved." His own reply came back like an echo through time. "Not if it's leaving the country." Then the flash, the roar, the shockwave that tore sound from the world. He remembered the weight of steel collapsing, the searing pain at the back of his skull, the world spinning into white. And silence. He opened his eyes, the memory clinging like smoke. Collins was watching him, reading the change in his expression. "You remember something," she said softly. He nodded barely. "I was there when it went off, but it wasn't an accident. I said it myself. You caused the explosion. I had to. They were trying to move the ordnance out, missiles, uranium rounds. Someone high up had ordered a transfer under civilian cover. They called it strategic repurposing. I called it treason." He ran a hand through his hair, eyes distant. "I set charges on the access corridor, just enough to collapse the entry. I made it look fatal. My team thought it was real. I told them to evacuate the moment the alarms went off. They followed orders. Then I detonated the secondary line and stayed behind." Collins's voice was quiet. "Why?" "Because if I was dead, no one would come looking for me or for what was buried here. I sealed the vault myself. I locked the system with my clearance, then walked out through the maintenance shaft before it caved in." His gaze drifted to the bridge above, rainlight glinting off the concrete. "The blast hit me on the exit. Shrapnel concussion. When I woke up miles downstream, I didn't remember anything." Collins listened without interruption, her face unreadable. "You were protecting the cash from your own government," she said finally. "Not from the government." He corrected, voice low. "From the ones using it. There were people inside the Pentagon, black-budget operators. They called themselves the Sentinel Council, claimed they were preparing for a post-collapse scenario, but what they really wanted was leverage money weapons gold, insurance against oversight." Collins frowned. "You're saying this was an inside operation?" "Not," was he said, looking up. "Is? If they fake the explosion, they're still active. And now that we've opened this place again, they know it." Collins folded her arms, thinking, "You have no proof of that yet." "You will," he said. "They'll come for it." Collins stared into the flames, the reflection of uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "If what you're saying is true," she said, "we just uncovered something bigger than either of us." Jack nodded, his hand resting on Ranger's head. The dog was tense, eyes fixed toward the darkness beyond the bridge, ears twitching at something neither of them could hear. New faces arrived, men in plain clothes, too well built and too quiet to be simple contractors. They wore civilian work vests, but their boots were tactical and their movements synchronized like soldiers used to following orders. Collins noticed first. She stood beside the command tent, arms crossed, eyes narrowing as a convoy of unmarked trucks rolled in. "We didn't authorize additional personnel," she muttered. A man in a gray suit stepped out of the lead truck, his smile professional but his badge unreadable. "Agent Collins," he said smoothly, "you can stand down your team. The site has been reassigned to a joint task force under the Defense Logistics Agency. We'll take it from here." Collins's jaw tightened. "Reassigned by whose order? National Security Council," the man replied, handing her a folded document. She'd scanned it quickly, real signatures, high clearance stamps, but the language was vague, intentionally so. "We're under federal mandate now. You and your agents can return to Cheyenne. Debriefing will be scheduled once the recovery is complete." Collins looked up sharply. "Recovery. The materials are to be transferred to a secure facility," the man said, his smile never breaking. "Standard protocol." But Jack, standing a few yards away, heard the subtext. He had used the same phrase once. It meant quiet extraction, no paperwork, no oversight. He stepped closer, voice calm. "Where's your unit based?" The man's eyes flicked to him briefly, dismissively. "Sir, this is a restricted operation. Please remain behind the line." Jack took one more step forward. "You're not Bureau, and you're not DLA. Those trucks don't belong to any federal agency." Collins glanced at him, realizing the same thing. The vehicles were the wrong make, the wrong license sequence. Her instincts flared. She turned back to the man. "I need to verify this order through my office." "There's no need," he said quietly. "You're relieved." Two men in vests moved behind her team, subtly boxing them in. Collins straightened, refusing to show nerves. "You have 30 minutes," the man added. "Then your people leave." She looked at her agents, then at Jack, and knew she had no leverage. The authority paper in her hand was real enough to end her career if she resisted. She exhaled through her nose. "Pack the equipment," she said flatly. Her team hesitated, confused, but obeyed. Jack caught her eye. She gave a tiny shake of her head. "Wait." As they moved away, she leaned close to him and whispered, "They're not recovery, they're retrieval." He nodded once. The trucks began unloading heavy crates marked survey gear, but the way the men handled them was too careful, too coordinated. They were preparing to move the vault's contents, not study them. Jack felt something cold settle in his gut. The same feeling he'd had years ago in that tunnel when the order came to transfer the weapons overseas. The same wrongness wrapped in protocol. Collins approached him again before leaving. "If you stay here," she said under her breath, "you're on your own. Officially, this site won't exist by morning. You're leaving because they told you to. Because I want to keep my badge long enough to report what's happening," she said. "Whatever they're doing, it's off the books. Stay out of their way." Jack watched as her convoy drove off, the federal seal on her SUV glinting in the last light. The trucks remained engines idling, men moving methodically like ants reclaiming a nest. He turned to the river, the cold air biting harder than before. Ranger sat beside him, silent tail still. "They're going to take it all," Jack murmured. The dog tilted his head as if listening. Jack stared across the water toward the hills where the old floodlight beams caught the edges of the vault door. "We buried it," once he said quietly, his voice steady now. "Let's do it right this time." Ranger gave a low bark, short and sharp, the kind that once signaled readiness. Jack almost smiled, a flicker of the soldier he used to be. He looked back toward the bridge where his shelters still stood, a few tarps, a fire pit, and a duffel filled with nothing but old clothes. That was all the world thought he had left. But what they didn't know was that a combat engineer never really stops building defenses. His gaze lingered on the shadows under the bridge where a half-buried service tunnel still ran parallel to the river, a forgotten maintenance shaft from the highway project decades ago. He had explored it once years back when he was still half lost in the fog of his memory. Now it might become something else entirely. Behind him, the mercenaries began loading the first crates from the vault, their flashlights cutting across the fog. Jack's hand dropped to Ranger's neck. "Quiet," he whispered. The dog stilled instantly. The soldier in him was awake again, and the mission, the one he thought he'd buried in the mud of time, had just found him once more. The night thickened like smoke over Redwater, the sound of diesel engines fading as the false contractors finished setting up their equipment around the site. Floodlights glowed faintly through the mist, throwing long, nervous shadows across the riverbank. Jack waited under the bridge motionless, listening to the rhythm of movement above the scrape of crates, the barked orders, the metallic clank of weapon cases being lifted. Ranger lay beside him, ears twitching at every sound. When the last truck's engine turned off, Jack took a slow breath and whispered, "They'll start extraction at dawn." He reached into his duffel and pulled out an old metal case. Inside were remnants of his former life blueprints tools, fragments of his engineer's past. He unfolded a worn diagram marked Site 7 Sentinel Lock Sequence. The lines were faint-smudged by time, but his fingers traced them as if no years had passed. The vault beneath them wasn't just a storage bunker, it was a system designed with multiple containment redundancies. He had built those redundancies himself, coded into the steel with manual triggers hidden along the access lines. He had designed it so that only someone with his exact clearance and procedural memory could engage the full lockdown. He smiled faintly. "Guess I left myself a way back in." The plan was simple in theory. Re-engage the original lockdown protocol before the mercenaries could move the crates. Once triggered, the vault doors would reseal, and the internal blast locks would fuse shut, making the contents irretrievable without specialized deconstruction gear. In other words, it would disappear again. He couldn't do it alone. At midnight, headlights flickered once across the far ridge. A coded signal, Collins. She had returned without her team in the civilian SUV. When she climbed down to his shelter, her face was pale from the cold, her expression a mix of anger and grim resolve. "They're transferring everything by sunrise," she said. "We have a few hours." Jack nodded. "We won't need more." He spread the old schematics between them, tracing lines in the dirt. "There are 3 hydraulic locks feeding from the central panel. If I can reach the auxiliary conduit, I can reinitiate Sentinel lockdown manually, but I'll need time." "You'll never get close without being seen," she said. "They've got at least a dozen men on the perimeter. Then we make noise where they aren't looking," he replied. Collins studied him for a moment. "You really think this will work?" "I designed it to," he said simply, "and I'm starting to remember how." They moved through the darkness like shadows, careful and silent. Collins cut the field lights one by one, using the auxiliary breakers, while Jack wove along the access trench, the one he had once used to seal the site years before. Ranger stayed glued to his side, every movement controlled and quiet. At the eastern edge of the vault, Jack found what he was looking for, a rusted junction box, half buried under mud. He pried it open with a screwdriver, revealing a tangle of ancient wires. He smiled at the sight, an engineer's kind of nostalgia. Collins whispered into a radio movement near the north ridge. 2 guards breaking off to check the lights. "Good," Jack said. "Keep them guessing." His hands worked quickly, reconnecting power leads, bypassing corroded circuits. Sparks flared, then the small indicator light blinked alive, dim but steady. The first of the locks re-engaged. One down, he crawled deeper into the trench toward the main conduit. The mud pulled at his knees and water seeped into his sleeves, but his focus didn't break. Every wire he touched was familiar, every sequence a muscle memory waking up. Left connector, right clamp, engage failsafe. He could hear his younger self giving those same instructions years ago, his voice steady through a radio headset. "If Washington burns, you guard what's left." He closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself. "Not this time," he whispered. Suddenly, movement behind him, one of the mercenaries had spotted Collins's distraction and doubled back. Jack heard the crunch of boots in gravel. He whispered, "Stay." Ranger froze, eyes locked. Jack reached the last panel and flipped the circuit. A low hum started beneath the earth, a deep vibration like a buried heartbeat. From the vault entrance came the faint hiss of hydraulics. The second lock had engaged. The mercenary shouted, "Who's there?" Jack ducked lower, staying still. Ranger's muscles tensed like wire. The man's flashlight beam swept across the trench. "Sentinel lockdown." Jack hissed. The command sliced through the dark like thunder. Ranger bolted, not at the man, but around him, sprinting toward the far cable conduit near the slope. The mercenary swung his light confused, then tripped as the dog clipped his legs mid-run. Ranger reached the panel teeth, gripping the cable release handle exactly where Jack had retrained him over the past year to complete the light linkage pull while Jack finished the manual lock sequence. With one pull, the final circuit closed. Deep underground, the vault groaned, steel grinding against steel. The floor beneath them shuddered as the blast doors sealed. Above the noise, the mercenary fired a warning shot into the dirt, shouting for backup, but Jack didn't flinch. He was watching the indicator lights along the ridge flare red one by one, a pattern only he understood. Collins's voice cut through the radio. "It's working. They're panicking." Jack smiled faintly. He was trained to guard what I couldn't remember, he said, watching Ranger return to panting, eyes bright. The hum beneath the ground grew louder, finalizing the lockdown. For the first time in years, the system and the soldier were both awake again. The sun never truly rose over Redwater that morning. It climbed behind a wall of smoke and low fog, turning the world a dull gray. The mercenaries were already in motion, their leader barking orders near the vault site, unaware the facility below had already sealed itself. Jack and Collins watched from the embankment near the bridge, crouched low behind a broken guardrail. Ranger was beside them still as stone, his breath fogging in the cold air. "They're bringing in cutting charges." Collins whispered her binoculars steady. "They think they can blast through the hatch." Jack nodded. "They can try. The internal locks will hold." "What about the bridge?" she asked. Jack followed her gaze upward. The concrete structure groaned under the weight of the trucks parked across it. The mercenaries had positioned equipment along the span, using the bridge as a staging point. It was a mistake, one he could use. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small transmitter. "That vault's deeper than they think," he said. "They'll come at it from the wrong angle. If they blow the ground support, it'll trigger the secondary plate I integrated during the state maintenance retrofit years ago." Collins frowned. "You left explosives under the bridge." "Failsafe," he said quietly. "Not explosives, detonation triggers integrated during the state maintenance retrofit a decade ago. Structural relays tied to the Sentinel lockdown meant to seal the site if compromised. You're saying you can bring down the bridge?" "Just the support layer," he corrected. "It'll collapse the access tunnel and bury the hatch under 100 tons of reinforced concrete." Collins considered it, then nodded slowly. "That would trap them on the wrong side." "Exactly." Below them, shouts rose as one of the mercenaries' machines struck metal. Sparks flashed. "They found the hatch," Collins said. Jack exhaled slowly, steadying his hands. "Then it's time." He lifted the transmitter thumb, resting on the worn toggle. But before he pressed it, he spoke quietly to Ranger. "Stay here." The dog tilted his head, eyes locked on him, understanding more than most men could. Jack smiled faintly. "We're not running this time." The first explosion came from the mercenaries. They had fired a shaped charge at the vault door. The sound rolled across the valley like thunder, shaking dust from the bridge above. Collins flinched, covering her ears. "They're desperate," she said. "They don't know it's already sealed," Jack replied. He adjusted the transmitter frequency, aligning it with the old emergency channel embedded in the bridge's design. His hands moved with the precision of training, long buried but never forgotten. He looked at Collins. "Once I trigger it, there'll be a 10-second delay. When that happens, call your team in." "They're waiting on my signal," she said. "I've got a Bureau convoy staged 5 miles out." "Good," he said. "Because when the ground goes, they'll hear it from there." Collins gave a faint smile. "You sure about this? I built it," he said. "I know exactly how it falls." Below, the mercenaries shouted for more explosives. The sound of drills echoed through the valley. Jack flipped the safety guard on the transmitter. For the record, Collins said quietly, "If this works, you're going to make a lot of powerful people very uncomfortable." Jack gave her a small, tired smile. Wouldn't be the first time. Then he pressed the switch. The sound was low, almost imperceptible at first, then it grew a distant rumble, a groaning shift in the steel and concrete of the old bridge. The mercenaries looked up confused. "What's that?" one shouted. Then the center span of the bridge cracked like thunder. The trucks jerked sideways, their tires lifting as the ground under them sank. A plume of dust and debris erupted into the air as the supports gave way. The entire midsection dropped in on itself, folding the service tunnel beneath it. The vault's entrance disappeared in a single muffled roar. Collins shielded her face from the wave of grit and smoke. When it cleared, the valley was silent except for the echo of falling stone. Below, the mercenaries scrambled, some limping, some shouting into radios that no longer worked. Their trucks were trapped behind the collapsed section cut off from the vault and the only road out. Collins raised her radio. "Now," she said firmly. Within minutes, sirens echoed from the highway. The Bureau's convoy swept in from both ends, black SUVs closing in like jaws. Helicopters thundered overhead. The mercenaries tried to run, but there was nowhere left to go. Collins and Jack stood on the ridge as the arrests began. One of the Bureau agents approached her, saluting quickly. "All suspects in custody, ma'am. We found encrypted drives and their trucks' names, account numbers, military contractors. Looks like they were funded through private channels." Collins nodded. "Secure everything. No leaks." The agent moved off. Jack stood beside her, silent, watching as the dust settled over the wreckage. "They won't rebuild this one," he said softly. Collins turned to him, her voice lower now. "You saved this country twice, Captain. They just forgot the first time." He looked out over the valley, the morning light breaking weakly through the smoke. "That's fine," he said. "I remembered." Ranger trotted up beside him, tail wagging faintly, and Jack rested a hand on the dog's head. "Come on, partner," he murmured. "Let's go home." 3 months later, winter had softened into a pale spring over Redwater. The river ran calmer now, its surface reflecting the clean lines of concrete and steel that had replaced the wrecked span. The air smelled of cement dust pine and the faint sweetness of thawing earth. A new bridge rose where the old one had fallen, not wide or grand, but solid, functional, modest, enduring. Its nameplate wasn't military or bureaucratic, just plain engraved letters, Bridge Number 47 Mercer Restoration Project. Jack Mercer stood beneath it, sleeves rolled up, his hands steady as he smoothed wet cement into a joint seam. He had grown leaner, the sharpness of field fatigue replaced by quiet strength. The shadows under his eyes had faded, replaced by something steadier, peace maybe, or purpose. Beside him, Ranger lay sprawled in the sun, one paw draped lazily over Jack's boot, his coat shining clean for the first time in years. The sound of a car rolling up the gravel road broke the calm. Jack looked up, wiping his hands on a rag as a familiar SUV stopped near the construction site. Agent Sarah Collins stepped out, sunglasses perched on her head, coffee cup in hand. "You weren't kidding," she said, walking toward him. "You really are rebuilding it." Jack smiled faintly. "Figured it owed us both another chance." She took in the scene, the neat stacks of tools, the newly poured pylons, the bridge stretching cleanly across the valley, and shook her head. "They finished the audit last week," she said. "Every weapon sealed, every record verified. You were right about everything." Jack didn't look up from the cement line. "And the others?" "The contractors are under federal indictment. The general who funded them resigned before he could be charged." She sipped her coffee. "The Bureau handed off oversight to CISA. They want you on their Infrastructure Security Board as a technical consultant. It's yours if you want it." Jack let the words hang in the cool air. "A desk job?" he asked finally. More like making sure no one builds something they shouldn't, she said. They even offered to move you to D.C. He looked out over the hills, the empty sky stretching endless above. No, he said softly. I think I'll stay here. Plenty of bridges need fixing. Collins smiled, half amused, half moved. So, this is it then? You're trading classified bunkers for county contracts? Jack chuckled. This time, I'm building something that doesn't need to be buried. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. You know, for a man who used to hate paperwork, your restoration plans are immaculate. Old habits, he said, his tone light. Ranger perked his head as she knelt to scratch behind his ears. You keepin' him on payroll too? She asked. Jack glanced down at the dog. He's management. Collins laughed, a quiet sound carried by the wind. They stood together in silence for a while, watching a pair of hawks glide across the valley. The bridge above them gleamed under the sun, its new paint already dusted with pollen. It wasn't just a span of concrete anymore. It was a marker, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been rebuilt. They'll write about this one day, Collins said quietly. About the man who found the Cold War's last secret and chose to bury it again. Jack looked at her eyes, calm. Then make sure they get the ending right. How does it end with quiet, he said. She nodded, as if that was enough. Take care of yourself, Captain. It's just Jack now, he said, offering a small salute out of habit. She returned it with a smile before heading back to her car. When her taillights disappeared beyond the ridge, the world settled again into the rhythm of tools, water, and wind. Jack picked up his trowel and went back to work. The bridge wasn't perfect yet. It needed finishing alignment patience. He liked that. He liked that there was still something left to build. Ranger shifted closer, resting his head against Jack's boot again, tail thumping once before he dozed off. The river murmured softly, carrying the echoes of what they buried. Jack paused, glancing up at the plaque fixed into the new concrete beam. The letters gleamed faintly under the light, Bridge number 47, Mercer Restoration Project. It wasn't a monument, not really. It was something quieter, a promise that what was once broken could stand again. He straightened, brushing dust from his hands, and looked out over the valley. The land was green again, dotted with wildflowers. For the first time in a long while, there were no fences, no armed patrols, no secrets buried in the soil. Just a man, a dog, and a bridge that would outlast them both. Good work today, he said softly. Ranger's tail flicked without opening his eyes. Jack smiled, picking up his tools. The wind swept through the open beams, whistling low like a voice remembering. The bridge stood solid, cutting across the valley, where silence once ruled an unspoken oath carved in concrete and time. If this story stayed with you, give it a like and subscribe for more. Which moment hit you hardest, when Ranger found the truth or when Jack rebuilt the bridge? Share your thoughts below and tell me where you're watching from.